Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Bellett. I've had about 20 years experience as a health and safety regulator. I started off in general workplace inspection and then worked my way through to a management role within occupational safety and health, a division of the Department of Labour. Headed up a team dealing with construction, forestry, agriculture and mining. And looking around the room today, I'm just amazed about the level of engagement in Canterbury at the moment. It was a different story in some ways back when I headed up the team. It was quite hard to get people in the room. But it's great that you're here and you're engaged. What I want to talk to you today about is the journey that you're going through and WorkSafe are going through as a regulator. And it's a journey from 20 years of the Health and Safety and Employment Act through to the Health and Safety at Work Bill, or soon to be the Act. Andrew talked about some historical test cases, and we all worked through those and learnt quite a lot about hazard management. But I think it was really the Pike River Royal Commission that taught us that as a society we've made some mistakes in relation to the way we manage health and safety. And not just as employers, self-employed people and employees, but we've made mistakes as regulator as well. The whole ethos of hazard management was you have a hazard, you control the hazard and take all practicable steps. So how did you as an employer know how far to go? It was a really difficult judgment to make, and as a regulator the intent was to provide you a lot of good guidance material so you could be sure that you were taking all practicable steps. However, a lot of guidance material was not available, a lot of good guidance material, and so as a regulator we've decided to address that. Catherine heads up a Canterbury rebuild team here. There was a group called the High Hazard Unit set up after Pike River to deal specifically with industries where there are high consequences, multiple fatality situations. And we've also set up a division in our head office. It's a standards setting team. So prior to the Royal Commission, we had about 3 or 4 people writing standards right across all industries. We now have around 30 people developing standards to help you. So I'll just take you through the journey really that where we came from. Now, the hazard management under the Health and Safety and Employment Act actually asked you to have an effective method to systematically identify your hazards. Now, how systematic were you in the identification of your hazards? They were existing hazards, and as time goes by, new hazards are created. So, and then you had to assess those hazards and determine whether or not they were significant. Now, I really want you to focus on that word systematic, because when we take that journey from hazard management into risk management, that systematic approach is critical. Many of you would have seen a rudimentary hazard register that directed you to identify the hazard, takes all practicable steps to eliminate it, isolate it or minimise it. There was a lot of focus on the practicable steps, but not always the all bit. A lot of situations there were many practicable steps taken, but not all practical steps. Now, the issue about a hazard register like this, and I guess this is one of the things that we're learning as a society as we go along, is that to take a hazard in isolation is probably not the right thing to do. You have to understand the hazard within the context the hazard is created. Once you identify the hazard under the old legislation, as you know, you had to apply the all practicable steps test. Now, I'm pretty confident, and having sat down on hundreds of interviews with employers after accidents, that the concept of all practicable steps was not widely understood. Because if you actually look at and break down the legal definition of all practicable steps, for those who already undertake risk assessments, you'll see some very common phraseology here, and I've highlighted them there. You had to have regard to the severity of the harm. You had to understand the likelihood of that harm occurring. And you also needed to apply contemporary thinking to the means available to prevent that harm. And of course, you had to balance that up with how available were those means and how much did they cost. So, in some ways, what was wrong with that? What was wrong with that in a way of managing a hazard? Because really, it is a risk-based approach to a hazard. So I think that just going back, the issue there was to apply that methodology to every hazard seemed like quite a lot of work. But remembering that we're systematic, and in some ways that's, I guess, the overarching lesson for all of us going forward from the journey from hazard management to risk management, is that that systematic approach must be applied. It could have been applied under the old regulatory system, but the risk management philosophy and risk management approach forces you to undertake that systematic approach. So what is the difference between a hazard and a risk? Does anyone like to have a guess? What would you say that animal was?
It doesn't matter whether it's got teeth or not.
Well,
Something regardless.
Yeah. So, is it a hazard or is it a risk?
It's a hazard.
That's great. And there's an expert on hazards and risk. So the difference here is placing a human in the picture, but risk management can also be used for reputation, can be used for financial loss and a range of things. But we're here in this room to talk about safety. So the risk is the interface between the hazard and the human, the likelihood that harm could result, and the consequences of those of that hazard. So this model that you see is very basic. Is a standard model to enable you to kick off your risk-based approach. Now, I'm not going to talk in detail about how to undertake risk assessments. I'm here to highlight the past and take us through to where we're going to go. Jim Knowles, one of our speakers, will be taking us more through what we call risk management. In the area I currently work in, and that's mines, tunnels and quarries, you call them critical risks, and that's a great way of looking at it. We call them principal hazards. Now, these are hazards that can cause multiple fatalities or single fatalities on an ongoing basis. The mining operations and quarrying operations regulations have actually recognised that you need to treat some of these, what you call critical risks, what we call principal hazards, differently, and have legislated that you must have specific management plans relating to those critical risks. So how do you create those plans? This risk management model is the right way to do it. First of all, you can undertake a contextual principal hazard assessment of your business. So what are those critical risks? The Charter has put some up, and that's great, but your particular organisation may have additional critical risks, as you call them, and that's a great place to start, because why wouldn't you start with the risks that are going to cause your business the most harm and your people the most harm? But you have to establish the whole context of your business. So in mining and tunnelling, we call that a broad brush risk assessment. So it's an exercise where you get good people in the room and who understand your business, and you lay out and work out in a systematic fashion, using history as an example of how the type of activity that you've done in the past, and understand where are the areas within our business that generate these critical risks. So you're establishing the context. You identify those risks. Now, that broad brush approach doesn't mean that you have to then, we've identified a critical risk here, so we now have to stop the whole broad brush risk assessment process and work on that critical risk and manage that risk. A broad brush just identifies that you need to have a specialised plan or management plan for that particular critical risk. So you don't have to stop your broad brush risk assessment. You just identify that you need a management plan for that. So you carry on and you identify all your risks. Then it gets down to some of your principal hazards or your critical risks, and you analyse those. You use a good cross-section of your workforce to do that, and you apply risk management and risk assessment techniques to do that. And then you evaluate those risks to determine if they're applicable, useful and achievable within your organisation, and then you control the risks. Now, controlling the risks, I was interested in hearing Andrew talk about as low as reasonably practicable, or as far as reasonably practicable in terms of risk treatment, or versus all practicable steps. Now, remembering all practicable steps was about the controls, and as far as reasonably practicable is about the level of risk. So they are quite different, and I guess we'll be going on another journey at some stage through some test cases to see what that actually ends up meaning. But in our minds, and the purpose we're in the room today is all about how far, how low do we want to get that risk for our people. So the controls under hazard management and the controls under risk management shouldn't change. They should be the same. So here's a classic risk management descriptor. Something goes from rare right through to almost certain. Now again, when you think about the definition of all practicable steps, that talked about the current state of knowledge about the means available or the likelihood of something happening. So when you're applying risk management philosophy, you should also think about this is not necessarily your personal opinion about whether or not something has happened in your personal experience. It's whether the collective knowledge of your industry and society are aware that this can happen or could happen or may happen. So you've always got to think in some ways in the third person and apply it to your business. If you haven't undertaken any risk assessment training, I'd highly recommend that you put yourself on a risk assessment course to truly understand how to apply likelihood, consequence and controls. Because the higher the severity or the consequence, the more rigid you have to think about the controls. So a lot of companies, for example, will have at a board level, will establish a matrix of an acceptable level of risk to their staff. So if the consequence and the likelihood equation is just too high, they'll simply say, we're not going to do this. Or they might then once they put in the controls, they might do a residual risk ranking and decide, well, given the residual risk, we could do this, but we must put in a hard control rather than an administrative control. Because if we don't have a hard control, we're relying on human factors. And there's one classic expression, to blame an accident on human error is like blaming falls on gravity. Because when you think about it, any accident, there's an element of human error somewhere. So having a hard control for some of your high consequence, high probability or high frequency type risks does help reduce that risk exposure. So thinking about the all practical steps definition, it used the term likelihood as well. So risk management versus hazard management, they both have likelihood. I don't know, can you see that? The consequences. Now a lot of companies set up their risk assessment processes based on both financial, health and safety, business interruption, reputation, and does it end up meeting their corporate objectives? You can do that. It does make a risk assessment process quite drawn out, and this type of framework is quite good for your broad brush or principal hazard risk assessment. But when you're getting down to tin tacks on how to manage a particular hazard, and you want the right people in the room to manage that hazard, having a PR person, an accountant, raising the issue about financial risk may not be that useful, but that's a business decision that you need to make. Again, all practicable steps definition talked about severity, the severity of harm if you don't achieve the result. And a severity is really a consequence. So again, all practicable steps really was a risk-based decision-making model on how to deal with your hazard. However, going back to the introduction, it's about a systematic approach to applying risk management going forward. We weren't that good at applying the all practicable steps systematic approach to hazard management. So if one thing that we have to change, and that is how we alter our business processes so that we start building this systematic approach to risk. So here's just a couple of, I tried to frame what really the difference was. So for hazard management, it was, yes, you have to identify the hazards, but you identify the hazards in a risk management process as well. You had to determine if it was a significant hazard, and then determine appropriate ways to either eliminate, isolate or minimise the hazard, but having regard to all practicable steps. So that was having regard to that almost risk-based approach under all practicable steps. Switching into risk management, which you will be going into, and your business processes will have to reflect that, because as a regulator and an inspector, when I come and see you after an accident, I will be asking you, what was your process to manage that risk? How did you get there? You know, I'll look at the controls, sure, but hindsight's a great thing, and that's not how legislation works in a courtroom. We don't use hindsight, perfection. We look at, before the event, what did you do? And we would be expecting you to have gone through a risk management approach, identify the hazards, analyse and evaluate them. And then you have to have regard to, have I got the right people, competent people? Have I got the right equipment? Have I got the right management systems that manage these people? And is the actual environment, when you take a day like today, conducive to a safe workplace? And so there's a lot of common factors that you have to consider within a risk management process. Then you determine the appropriate ways to control the hazard, and that's using that as low as reasonably practicable, or LARP, some people call it. So is hazard management better or worse than risk management, or vice versa? I'm suggesting that history has told us that hazard management should have worked, but the Pike River Commission told us that it didn't, and it wasn't just that, it was OECD statistics that told us that we were languishing at the bottom of our fatality and serious harm rates. We weren't doing very well at hazard management, and so the government recognised that and changed the law, or are about to change the law, to force us to be more systematic. So the risk-based approach, this doesn't deal with, well, I've got a hazard, what's our control for that hazard? It asks you to look at the whole context around that, that person being exposed to that risk. And as I say, it asks you to look at the right people and the right place with the right gear, with the right plant and equipment to doing the work. So I think it's the right move to be more systematic, and because hazard management didn't work as well as we would like. And the only way you're going to understand risk assessment is to train yourself in it. It's something that needs a good cross-section of your workforce to be involved with. And as you know, worker engagement is quite a hard nut to crack. It's hard to get people engaged in this process, but if you give your people the skills to understand what risk management's all about, you'll actually find them becoming quite engaged. And on mine sites, we see a real enthusiasm to get involved in risk assessment work, because it's a structured, stepped process through a whole task, and it outlines all the steps associated with those tasks, and it makes people think ahead of time on what they need to focus on.